Officer Ray Shockey never forgot the moment he realized his service weapon was useless. 3 shots from his .357 Magnum, 3 direct hits. The creature just stood there, staring at him with those huge eyes. No blood, no wounds, no reaction at all. Just a slight tilt of its head, as if it were curious about the noise. This was not his first encounter with the impossible. 20 years on the Loveland police force had shown him plenty of strange things, but nothing had prepared him for what lurked along the banks of the Little Miami River. Something that walked upright like a man, but had the features of an amphibian. Something that seemed to have an intelligence far beyond any known animal. The locals called it the Loveland Frogman, and for more than 60 years, it has haunted the quiet roads of southern Ohio. It leaves behind only footprints, photographs, and the testimony of terrified witnesses who swear they met something that should not exist. Loveland, Ohio sits 20 miles northeast of Cincinnati. In 1955, it was a sleepy farming community of fewer than 6,000 residents. The Little Miami River wound through the heart of town like a dark ribbon. Its banks were thick with cattails and willows that provided perfect cover for local wildlife. Raccoons, deer, and the occasional great blue heron were common sights along the water. The town had been built around the railroad in 1876. By the 1950s, it was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors. Strange events were rare. Crime was almost non-existent. The most excitement most residents ever experienced was the annual Corn Festival. But all of that changed on a warm spring evening in May of 1955. Robert Honeycutt was driving home from Cincinnati along Riverside Drive. He was a traveling salesman who had made this trip dozens of times before. The route offered scenic views of the river. It also avoided the heavier traffic of the main highways. It was peaceful, quiet, safe. As Honeycutt rounded a gentle curve near the Loveland Boat Club, his headlights lit up 3 figures standing beside the road. At first, he assumed they were people, maybe motorists with car trouble, or fishermen heading to the water. But as his car drew closer, the details became impossible to ignore. The figures were roughly 4 feet tall. They had humanoid shapes, but clearly non-human features. Their skin appeared dark and leathery in the harsh glare of his headlights. Most disturbing were their faces. Honeycutt later told people they looked like frogs, but with an unmistakable intelligence that made his blood run cold. Large, big eyes reflected his headlights like mirrors. Their mouths seemed impossibly wide. They stretched almost from ear to ear. When they turned to look at his approaching car, their movements were coordinated and deliberate. Not the panicked reaction of startled animals, but the calculated response of thinking beings. For several seconds, man and creatures stared at each other across the darkness. Then, without any apparent communication between them, all 3 beings moved toward the river with surprising grace and speed. Within moments, they had vanished into the night. They left Honeycutt alone on the empty road with nothing but questions. When he arrived home, Honeycutt called the Loveland Police Department. The desk sergeant who took his call was polite, but doubtful. Strange animal sightings were not uncommon along the river. This was especially true during spring when wildlife was more active. The officer suggested that Honeycutt had probably seen some river otters, or perhaps a family of raccoons. But Honeycutt insisted these were not animals, at least not like any he had ever seen. The police report filed that night called the incident a possible wildlife encounter. However, it also noted Honeycutt's certainty about what he had witnessed. It mentioned his reputation as a reliable member of the community. 2 nights later, the phone rang again. Ray Shockey was driving home from his shift at the Ford plant. He spotted something large, standing upright near the same stretch of Riverside Drive. Like Honeycutt, Shockey told about a humanoid figure with clearly amphibian features. But his account included more details that made the encounter even more unsettling. Shockey claimed the creature was holding something in its hands, a metal rod or wand that seemed to give off sparks from one end. The being appeared to be looking at this device when Shockey's headlights struck it. For a brief moment, He could see the creature's face clearly. The expression was not one of surprise or fear. It was annoyance, as if the interruption was unwelcome but not unexpected. The creature then raised the sparking device above its head. Shockey interpreted this as either a gesture of greeting or perhaps a warning. Before he could decide which, the being turned and walked purposefully toward the river. Its walk was awkward but efficient. It took longer strides than any human of similar height could manage. Shockey's report was filed alongside Honeycutt's. For the first time, the Loveland Police Department began to take these sightings seriously. Chief John Fritz ordered increased patrols along the river road. He asked his officers to keep detailed notes of any unusual observations. He also contacted the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to ask about any animal releases or research projects that might explain the encounters. The response was clear. No research involving exotic amphibians was being conducted in the Miami Valley. No animals matching the descriptions had been reported missing from any zoos or private collections in the tri-state area. Whatever residents were seeing along Riverside Drive, it was not part of any known scientific study. As word of the sightings spread through Loveland, more witnesses came forward. Janet Morrison was a nurse returning from a late shift at the hospital. She reported seeing a tall figure standing in her headlights on the bridge over the Little Miami. Margaret Collins told people about finding strange three-toed footprints in the mud near her backyard, which bordered the river. Each new account added to a growing body of evidence that something unusual was living in or near the waters of the Little Miami River. But it was Officer Mark Matthews who would provide the first concrete proof. Matthews was new to the Loveland Police Department when he met the creature on the 14th of October, 1955. He had been with the force for less than 6 months. He was still eager to prove himself to his fellow officers. When he volunteered for the late shift along Riverside Drive, his colleagues warned him about the frog reports. They treated them as something between a joke and a local curiosity. Matthews was patrolling near the old railroad trestle around 11:30 that night. He saw movement in his side vision. Something large had crossed the road about 50 yards ahead of his cruiser. It was now visible in the beam of his spotlight. The officer brought his car to a stop. He focused the light on what appeared to be a figure crouched near the guardrail. The being was larger than previous witnesses had told about. It was possibly 5 feet tall when standing upright. Its skin looked wet and dark green, almost black in places. The head was clearly amphibian in shape, but it was sized differently than any frog or toad Matthews had ever seen. The eyes were enormous. They seemed to glow with their own inner light rather than simply reflecting his spotlight. Matthews later reported that the creature looked directly at him for several long seconds before rising to its full height. The movement was fluid and controlled. It displayed a build that suggested both strength and remarkable agility. The officer reached for his radio to call for backup. When he looked up again, the being had vanished. A thorough search of the area revealed nothing except some disturbed vegetation near the water's edge. But Matthews found something else that convinced him the encounter had been real. 3-toed footprints in the soft earth, each measuring about 6 inches in length. The impressions were deep and clearly defined. They showed what appeared to be webbed digits and small claw marks at the tips. Matthews photographed the footprints. He made plaster casts before reporting the incident to Chief Fritz. The physical evidence marked a turning point in how the department handled these reports. Whatever was happening along Riverside Drive, it was leaving real proof of its presence. The photographs and casts were sent to wildlife experts at the University of Cincinnati for study. Dr. Harold Zimmerman was a professor of zoology. He looked at the evidence with professional interest but growing confusion. The footprints showed features of several different animal families. They did not match any known species exactly. The 3-toed structure was consistent with certain bird tracks, but the size and depth suggested a much heavier animal. The apparent webbing indicated an aquatic lifestyle, but the claw marks were more typical of land-dwelling predators. Most puzzling was the spacing of the prints. This suggested a bipedal gait uncommon among amphibians. Dr. Zimmerman's official report said that the tracks were of unknown origin. It recommended further investigation if more evidence became available. The winter of 1955 brought a temporary halt to the sightings, but they resumed in March of 1956 with an encounter that would become the most detailed and disturbing report in the Loveland police files. Officer Roy Kirby was responding to a call about suspicious activity near the boat launch just after midnight on the 3rd of March. A thick fog was rolling off the river. This reduced visibility to less than 20 yards. Kirby was using his spotlight to sweep the area when the beam caught something moving along the water's edge. The figure was clearly humanoid, but wrong in every detail that mattered. It stood about 4.5 feet tall, with a lean but muscular build. The skin appeared smooth and wet. It reflected the spotlight with an oily sheen. The head was the most disturbing feature. It combined human-like intelligence with clearly amphibian features. Kirby later told people about the eyes as like looking into deep water at night. They were large and dark, with no visible whites. They seemed to hold a kind of awareness that made him deeply uncomfortable. The mouth was wide and lipless. It stretched almost from ear to ear. When the creature opened it to make a sound, Kirby could only say it was like a cross between a bullfrog's croak and human speech. The officer reached for his service weapon, but found himself hesitating. The creature showed no signs of aggression. There was something in its posture that suggested intelligence rather than animal instinct. It tilted its head as if studying him. Then it raised one arm in what might have been a gesture of acknowledgement or warning. For nearly a minute, officer and creature regarded each other across the foggy riverbank. Then the being turned and walked into the water with surprising grace. Kirby watched as it went under completely. It left only a series of circles to mark its passage. When backup arrived 15 minutes later, Kirby's report was met with doubt until the officers found the footprints. 3 sets of tracks led from the tree line to the water's edge. Each showed the same 3-toed pattern that had become familiar to the Loveland Police Department. But these prints revealed more details that had not been visible in previous encounters. Alongside the foot impressions were what appeared to be handprints. They showed 4 long fingers with obvious webbing between them. The prints suggested that the creature had been moving on all 4s for part of its journey. It only stood upright when it noticed Kirby's approach. This discovery added a new dimension to the mystery. These were not just unusual animals behaving strangely. They were beings capable of complex movement and deliberate interaction with human observers. The implications were unsettling enough that Chief Fritz decided to limit access to the reports. He discouraged his officers from discussing the incidents with the media. Despite these precautions, word of the Loveland Frogman began to spread beyond the immediate community. A reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer heard rumors of the police reports. He requested interviews with witnesses. When Chief Fritz declined to comment officially, the reporter began contacting residents directly. The first newspaper article about the Loveland Frogman appeared on the 15th of April, 1956. It was a brief piece buried on page 7 of the local section. It treated the sightings as an amusing curiosity rather than a serious mystery. But the article included enough details to attract the attention of other news outlets and amateur investigators. By summer, Loveland was experiencing its first wave of paranormal tourism. Weekend visitors from Cincinnati and Dayton would drive along Riverside Drive. They hoped to catch a glimpse of the creature. Most left disappointed, but a few reported their own sightings that seemed to match the earlier accounts. Dr. Elizabeth Warren was a creature researcher from the University of Kentucky. She arrived in Loveland in July to conduct her own investigation. She interviewed witnesses. She looked at the physical evidence. She spent several nights observing the river from hidden positions. Her preliminary report was published in the Journal of Unexplained Phenomena. It said that the witnesses were telling about encounters with an unknown species of amphibian. Dr. Warren noted the consistency of the accounts across multiple independent witnesses. She also noted the presence of physical evidence that supported their claims. She theorized that the Little Miami River might harbor a population of previously undiscovered creatures. These might have evolved from common ancestors with known amphibian species, but adapted to a more land-based lifestyle. The scientific interest in the Loveland frogman reached its peak in 1957. The Smithsonian Institution sent a team to investigate the reports, led by Dr. Michael Harrison. The expedition spent 3 weeks documenting the sightings and searching for more evidence of the creatures. The Smithsonian team found no new physical traces of the beings, but their interviews with witnesses yielded some intriguing patterns. All of the encounters had occurred within a 2-mile stretch of the Little Miami River. This suggested a limited territory. Most sightings happened during spring and fall months. This indicated possible seasonal behavior. Every witness told about the creatures as displaying signs of intelligence rather than simple animal instinct. Dr. Harrison's final report stopped short of confirming the existence of an unknown species, but it did not dismiss the possibility either. However, funding for more research was not forthcoming. Scientific interest in the Loveland frogman gradually declined. By 1958, the sightings had become less frequent. Some began to assume that whatever had been living along the river had either moved on or died out. This assumption proved wrong when the creatures returned with a vengeance in the winter of 1972. Officer Ray Shockey was the same man who had reported one of the first sightings in 1955. He was nearing retirement when he had his second encounter with the Loveland frogman. On the evening of the 3rd of March, 1972, exactly 16 years after Officer Kirby's detailed sighting, Shockey was patrolling Riverside Drive. His headlights caught something crossing the road ahead. The creature was larger than those told about in the 1950s reports. It stood nearly 6 feet tall with a more robust build. Its movements were confident and purposeful as it walked upright across the asphalt. When Shockey's headlights struck it, the being turned to face the approaching patrol car. It showed no sign of fear or surprise. Shockey brought his vehicle to a stop about 30 feet from the creature. He reached for his radio, but before he could call for backup, the being began to approach his car. Its walk was steady and deliberate. Each step brought it closer to the driver's side window. The officer later told people about feeling a mixture of terror and fascination as the creature drew near. He could see its features clearly in the light from his headlights and spotlight. The face was clearly amphibian, but showed signs of advanced intelligence. The eyes seemed to study him with careful attention. It was as if it was weighing his intentions or capabilities. When the creature reached the side of the patrol car, it placed one webbed hand against the driver's side window. Shockey reported that the touch was gentle but firm. He could feel the warmth of the being through the glass. For several seconds, they regarded each other through the barrier of the car window. Then the creature stepped back. It made a series of gestures that Shockey interpreted as communication attempts. It pointed toward the river, then back at itself, then toward the officer. The meaning seemed clear enough. This was its territory. Shockey was being warned not to interfere. The being then turned and walked back toward the river with the same measured pace it had displayed throughout the encounter. Shockey watched until it disappeared into the darkness. He then immediately radioed for help. When backup arrived, the officers found clear 3-toed footprints in the soft shoulder of the road, but they also discovered something new: scratches in the paint of Shockey's patrol car where the creature had touched the window. The marks were too shallow to be accidental damage, but too precise to be random scratches. Study of the scratches showed a pattern consistent with clawed fingertips, but the spacing was unlike anything in known wildlife databases. The marks became another piece of physical evidence supporting the reality of the Loveland frogman encounters. This time, the creature had left its mark not just in mud, but on a police vehicle itself. Officer Mark Johnson had been with the Loveland Police Department for 3 years. He experienced what would become the most documented encounter with the creature. On the 17th of March, 1972, just 2 weeks after Shockey's latest sighting, Johnson was responding to a report of a possible injured animal on Riverside Drive. He found much more than he had bargained for. The call had come from a motorist who claimed to see something large lying in the roadway near the old railroad bridge. Johnson arrived to find what appeared to be a creature sprawled across the center line of the road. His first assumption was that it was a large animal that had been struck by a vehicle, possibly a deer or a large dog. Johnson approached on foot with his flashlight drawn. He was ready to move the dead animal off the roadway. But as his light fell across the prone figure, he realized he was looking at something that defied easy explanation. The body was humanoid in shape, but covered in what appeared to be dark, moist skin. The limbs were long and lean. They ended in hands and feet that showed obvious webbing between the digits. As Johnson moved closer, the creature suddenly raised its head and looked directly at him. The officer later told people about the moment as one of the most terrifying experiences of his career. The being's eyes were large and glowing. They showed an intelligence that seemed almost human. Its mouth opened slightly. This revealed what appeared to be rows of small, sharp teeth. For a moment, neither moved. Then the creature began to rise to its feet with fluid grace that suggested it had not been injured at all. Johnson stepped back and reached for his service weapon, but the being showed no signs of aggression. Instead, it seemed to study the officer with calm curiosity. The creature stood about 5.5 feet tall, with a lean but muscular build. Its skin appeared to be naturally moist. It glistened in the beam of Johnson's flashlight. The head was sized like that of a large frog or toad, but showed adaptations for upright posture and enhanced brain capacity. Johnson later reported that the encounter lasted for several minutes. During this time, the creature made no threatening moves, but also showed no fear of the armed officer. It seemed to be weighing the situation with careful intelligence. It occasionally tilted its head, as if trying to understand Johnson's intentions. Finally, the being turned and began walking toward the guardrail that separated the road from the river. Its movements were graceful and purposeful. They displayed a coordination that seemed impossible for any known amphibian. When it reached the railing, the creature paused and looked back at Johnson one final time. Then it jumped over the barrier and disappeared into the darkness. Johnson immediately called for backup and requested that the area be blocked off for investigation. When other officers arrived, they found clear evidence of the encounter. 3-toed footprints marked the creature's path from the center of the road to the guardrail. Handprints on the metal railing showed where it had gripped the barrier before jumping over. Most significantly, Johnson had managed to photograph the creature during their confrontation. The images were blurry due to low light conditions and the officer's understandable nervousness, but they showed clear evidence of a large, upright being with clearly non-human features. The photographs were studied by experts at several universities and law enforcement agencies. While the image quality prevented clear identification, all agreed that the photos showed something that did not match any known animal species. The size and posture were consistent with previous witness accounts of the Loveland Frogman. The photographs became the first visual evidence that the creature was real. The 1972 sightings marked the beginning of a new phase in the Loveland Frogman phenomenon. Unlike the earlier reports, which had been treated as local curiosities, these encounters attracted national attention. Paranormal investigators from across the country descended on Loveland. They hoped to document their own meetings with the creature. The increased attention brought both benefits and problems for the small community. Tourism revenue increased as visitors came to explore the legend, but the constant presence of researchers and thrill seekers began to strain local resources. The Loveland Police Department found itself fielding dozens of reports each month. Most of these proved to be wrong identifications or hoaxes. Chief Fritz was now in his final years before retirement. He established strict rules for investigating frogman reports. Only trained officers were allowed to respond to sightings. All physical evidence had to be photographed and catalogued before being released to researchers. These measures helped separate genuine encounters from the growing number of false reports. Despite the increased scrutiny, legitimate sightings continued to occur. In September 1972, a family camping along the Little Miami River reported being observed by a tall, humanoid figure. It watched them from the opposite bank for nearly an hour. The creature made no attempt to approach or communicate, but seemed intensely interested in their activities. The father of the family, Robert Martinez, later told police that the being seemed to be studying their behavior. It would move its head to follow their movements around the campsite. When they built a fire, it leaned forward as if curious about the flames. When they prepared food, it appeared to watch every step of the process. Martinez said the experience was both terrifying and fascinating. The creature showed no signs of hostility, but its constant observation made the family deeply uncomfortable. They eventually packed up their campsite and left while the being was still watching from across the river. In November of the same year, a group of high school students reported encountering two of the beings while exploring the ruins of an old mill near the river. The creatures were told about as smaller than those in previous reports. This led some researchers to speculate about a family group or breeding population. The students, led by senior class president Angela Foster, had been exploring the abandoned mill as part of a local history project. The mill had been built in the 1800s, but had been closed for decades. Its ruins sat on a small island in the middle of the Little Miami River. Foster later told police that they had been taking photographs of the old mill wheel when they heard splashing in the water nearby. At first, they assumed it was fish or maybe a beaver, but then they saw two figures emerge from the water onto the rocky shore of the island. The creatures were smaller than those in other reports. They stood only about 3.5 feet tall, but they had the same basic features: amphibian heads, webbed hands and feet, and that same unsettling intelligence in their eyes. The students watched from behind the mill ruins as the two beings moved around the island. They seemed to be searching for something. They picked up rocks and looked at them before tossing them aside. The creatures communicated with each other through a series of low, croaking sounds that almost sounded like words. After about 10 minutes, the creatures noticed the students watching them. They stopped their activities and stared directly at the hiding teenagers. Foster said, "The moment felt like it lasted forever." Both species studied each other across the divide. Finally, the creatures turned and slipped back into the water. They disappeared beneath the surface. The students waited another hour before venturing out from their hiding spot. They found clear footprints in the mud where the creatures had been walking. As the 1970s progressed, sightings of the Loveland Frogman became less frequent but more detailed. Witnesses began reporting observations of the creatures engaging in what appeared to be complex behaviors. Some told about seeing them handling objects or working together in coordinated activities. Dr. Richard McCall was a biologist from the University of Chicago. He spent several months in Loveland during 1974, studying the reports and interviewing witnesses. His research suggested that the creatures displayed signs of advanced intelligence and social organization rarely seen in amphibian species. Dr. McCall interviewed over 50 witnesses during his time in Loveland. He found remarkable consistency in their accounts. This was true even among people who had no contact with each other. All told about the same basic physical features. All mentioned the creature's apparent intelligence. Most reported feeling that they were being studied rather than simply observed. One of the most intriguing accounts came from elderly farmer William Tucker. Tucker owned property that bordered the Little Miami River about a mile upstream from the main sighting area. He claimed to have observed the creatures on multiple occasions over several years. Tucker told Dr. McCall that he often saw the beings at dawn and dusk. They would emerge from the water to forage along the riverbank. He told about watching them use tools. These included sticks to probe in the mud for food and rocks to crack open freshwater mussels. Most remarkably, Tucker claimed to have seen the creatures constructing what appeared to be shelters in the riverbank. Using mud, stones, and vegetation, they would build dome-shaped structures that were partially submerged. Tucker said these structures were always built in areas where the current was slow and the water was deep. Dr. McCall was intrigued by Tucker's account and asked to examine the alleged shelter sites. Tucker led him to several locations along his property where the structures had been built. While the shelters themselves were gone, likely washed away by spring floods, there was evidence of their former existence. Depressions in the riverbank showed where mud had been excavated. Piles of stones were arranged in patterns that seemed too organized to be natural. Most convincingly, Tucker showed Dr. McCall several three-toed footprints preserved in dried mud near the construction sites. The theory Dr. McCall developed was intriguing, but remained unproven due to the lack of physical specimens or clear photographic evidence. He suggested that the Loveland frogman might represent an evolutionary branch that had developed along different lines from known amphibians. According to his hypothesis, an isolated population living in the cave systems and underground waterways of the Miami Valley could have evolved enhanced intelligence and bipedal locomotion over thousands of years. The creatures might have developed tool use and social organization as adaptations to their unique environment. Critics argued that the witness accounts, while consistent, were insufficient to establish the existence of an unknown species without additional scientific validation. The lack of physical remains or clear photographs made it impossible to prove that the creatures were real rather than misidentifications or hoaxes. By the late 1970s, scientific interest in the Loveland frogman had largely faded. The creature became primarily the domain of creature researchers and paranormal enthusiasts rather than mainstream researchers. However, the sightings continued to occur with enough regularity to maintain local interest in the phenomenon. The 1980s brought a new generation of witnesses and investigators to the Loveland frogman mystery. Advances in photography and recording equipment allowed for better documentation of encounters, but clear proof remained hard to find. In 1985, a team of researchers from the International Society of Creature Research established a permanent observation post along the Little Miami River, led by Dr. Patricia Stevens. Their goal was to conduct long-term surveillance of the area. They hoped to document the creatures using modern scientific methods. The observation post operated for 3 years. During this time, team members recorded numerous unexplained sounds and several brief visual contacts with unidentified beings. However, the quality of their evidence was insufficient to convince the broader scientific community of the creature's existence. Dr. Stevens and her team used night vision cameras, motion sensors, and underwater recording equipment to monitor the river. They documented strange sounds that seemed to be some form of communication. These included low-frequency vocalizations that were unlike anything produced by known amphibians in the area. On several occasions, the motion sensors were triggered by something large moving through the water. But when the team investigated, they found only ripples on the surface and sometimes three-toed tracks in the mud. The most compelling evidence came in the summer of 1987. Team member Dr. James Rodriguez was conducting a nighttime observation session when he spotted a large figure moving along the opposite bank of the river. Through his night vision equipment, he could see what appeared to be a bipedal creature about 5 feet tall. Dr. Rodriguez managed to film several minutes of footage, showing the creature moving through the shallow water near the bank. The being appeared to be searching for something. It occasionally bent down to examine objects on the river bottom. However, when the footage was analyzed by experts, the results were inconclusive. The night vision equipment created a grainy image that made clear identification impossible. Some experts believed the footage showed an unknown animal. Others argued it could be a person in unusual clothing or equipment. One of the most intriguing discoveries made by the research team was a series of underwater caves along the riverbank. These had not been previously mapped. Exploration of these caverns revealed a complex network of tunnels and chambers that could potentially provide habitat for an unknown species. The caves extended for miles underground. They connected with other waterways in the region. Some chambers were large enough to house a substantial population of medium-sized creatures. The water in the caves was consistently warmer than the river. This was possibly due to underground springs. The caves showed signs of recent occupation. This included areas where vegetation had been cleared and rocks had been arranged in patterns that suggested intelligent design. However, the team found no direct evidence of the creatures themselves. Dr. Stevens theorized that the creatures might be aware of human monitoring efforts and had adapted their behavior accordingly. The cave system provided numerous escape routes and hiding places that would make detection extremely difficult. Local folklore began to add new elements during this period. This reflected the evolving understanding of the Loveland Frogman phenomenon. Native American legends from the region had been largely overlooked in earlier investigations. These told about amphibian-like beings that had lived along the rivers for countless generations. The Miami tribe, who had originally inhabited the area, had stories of water spirits that could take physical form. These beings were said to be guardians of the rivers and streams. They protected the natural balance from human interference. According to these accounts, the beings were peaceful, but would defend their territory if threatened. Elder Joseph Whitehorse of the Miami Nation shared some of these stories with researchers in 1988. He explained that his ancestors had always known about the water walkers. They were considered sacred beings who bridged the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. Whitehorse said the traditional stories told about the water walkers as teachers who could share knowledge with humans who showed them proper respect. However, as more people settled in the area and the rivers became polluted, the beings withdrew deeper into their hidden places. The parallels to modern frogman encounters were striking. They suggested that the phenomenon might have much deeper historical roots than previously realized. The creatures might not be unknown animals at all. They might be entities that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds. The 1990s saw a decline in reported sightings. This led some to speculate that the creatures had either died out or relocated to more remote areas. However, the development of the internet allowed witnesses to share their experiences more easily. A new pattern of encounters began to emerge. Reports from this period told about the creatures as more elusive and cautious than in previous decades. Witnesses spoke of brief glimpses and fleeting contacts, rather than the extended encounters that had characterized earlier sightings. This change in behavior suggested that the beings had learned to avoid human detection more effectively. The most significant development of the 1990s was the discovery of additional physical evidence. Hair and tissue samples were found along the riverbank. DNA study of these specimens yielded puzzling results. They showed genetic markers that were similar to known amphibian species, but with significant variations that could not be explained. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a geneticist from Ohio State University. She looked at the samples and found them to be unlike anything in current databases. The DNA showed features of both amphibian and reptilian lineages. Some sequences appeared to be completely novel. The genetic evidence raised new questions about the nature of the Loveland frogman. If the creatures were indeed unknown animals, their evolutionary history was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The unusual DNA suggested a species that had diverged from known amphibians millions of years ago. They possibly developed in isolation until recent contact with human populations. Dr. Mitchell's analysis revealed several puzzling features. The DNA contained sequences that were not found in any known species. Some of these sequences appeared to code for proteins related to advanced neurological development. Others seemed to be connected to enhanced sensory capabilities. Most intriguingly, the genetic material showed signs of recent evolutionary pressure. Certain genes appeared to be actively evolving at a rate much faster than normal. This suggested that the creatures were adapting to changing environmental conditions or perhaps to increased contact with humans. The implications of this genetic evidence were staggering. If confirmed, it would suggest that an unknown species of highly intelligent amphibian had been living in the waterways of Ohio for thousands of years. The creatures had not only survived, but had continued to evolve and adapt to the modern world. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Loveland Frogman remained one of creature research's most persistent mysteries. Despite decades of investigation and hundreds of witness reports, clear proof of the creature's existence continued to escape researchers. The 21st century brought new technologies and investigative methods to the study of the Loveland Frogman, but it also introduced new challenges. Urban development along the Little Miami River reduced the creature's potential habitat. Increased human activity in the area made sightings less likely. Trail cameras and motion sensors deployed by modern researchers captured numerous images of wildlife along the riverbank, but none provided clear evidence of the creatures told about in witness accounts. Some investigators believed this absence of photographic evidence suggested that the beings had become extinct or had moved to more remote locations. However, reports of encounters continued to trickle in from time to time. In 2016, a kayaker on the Little Miami River reported being observed by a large, upright figure standing among the trees along the bank. The witness told about the same basic features that had been reported for more than 60 years: man-like shape, amphibian features, and intelligent behavior. The kayaker, environmental scientist Dr. Lisa Parker, had been conducting a water quality survey when she had her encounter. She was taking samples near a bend in the river when she noticed something watching her from the opposite bank. Dr. Parker initially thought it was a person, perhaps another researcher or a fisherman, but as she looked more closely through her binoculars, she realized she was looking at something that did not fit any known category. The figure stood about 6 feet tall with a lean, muscular build. Its skin appeared dark and moist. It glistened in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. The head was clearly non-human. It had large eyes and a wide mouth that gave it an unmistakably amphibian appearance. Dr. Parker watched the creature for nearly 20 minutes as it observed her work. It showed obvious interest in her scientific equipment. It tilted its head when she used different instruments. When she collected water samples, it leaned forward as if trying to understand what she was doing. The encounter ended when Dr. Parker accidentally dropped a sample container. This created a loud splash. The creature immediately turned and disappeared into the dense vegetation along the bank. Despite searching the area later, she found no trace of where it had gone. More recently, in 2019, construction workers renovating a bridge over the river reported finding 3-toed footprints in the muddy shore below their work site. The prints matched the pattern established in earlier encounters. This suggested that whatever had been leaving these traces was still active in the area. The construction foreman, Mike Sullivan, initially thought the prints were from a large bird, but when he measured them, he found they were nearly 8 inches long and showed clear webbing between the toes. The depth of the impressions suggested something much heavier than any known bird in the region. Sullivan took photographs of the prints and showed them to local wildlife officials. They were unable to identify what could have made such tracks. The spacing between individual footprints suggested a creature walking upright on 2 legs. What made the discovery even more unusual was the location. The prints were found on a muddy bank directly beneath the bridge. This was in an area that was normally underwater. The river level had dropped due to a recent drought. This exposed mudflats that had been submerged for years. This suggested that the creature had been active in the area for a long time. Its tracks had usually been hidden beneath the water. The drought provided a rare glimpse into evidence that was normally invisible to human observers. The persistence of these reports spans multiple generations of witnesses. This raises questions that science has yet to answer clearly. Are the people of Loveland meeting survivors of an ancient species that has managed to avoid scientific detection? Are they witnessing something that exists at the edges of our understanding of biology and evolution? The Loveland Police Department still maintains files on the frogman encounters. They are rarely accessed except by researchers and journalists investigating the phenomenon. The physical evidence collected over the decades remains unexplained. It neither proves nor disproves the existence of the creatures told about by witnesses. Current Police Chief Thomas Brady has worked for the department for over 30 years. He has seen the files and spoken with some of the original witnesses. While he remains officially neutral on the question of the creature's existence, he acknowledges that the consistency of the reports is remarkable. "I've seen a lot of strange things in my time as a police officer," Brady said in a recent interview, "but the Frogman reports are different. The witnesses are credible people. Police officers, nurses, construction workers, teachers, these are not people who are prone to flights of fancy." Brady noted that the department continues to receive occasional reports of sightings. While most turn out to be misidentifications of known animals, some remain unexplained. The department treats each report seriously and investigates when possible. Dr. Jennifer Walsh is a creature researcher who has studied the Loveland case for more than 20 years. She believes that the consistency of the reports and the quality of the witnesses make a compelling argument for the reality of the phenomenon. She points out that many of the witnesses were law enforcement officers. These were trained observers who would be unlikely to mistake common animals for something extraordinary. The physical evidence, while not conclusive, supports the witness accounts in remarkable detail. Dr. Walsh has spent hundreds of hours interviewing witnesses and examining the evidence. She has walked the banks of the Little Miami River at all hours of the day and night. While she has never had her own encounter with the creatures, she remains convinced that something unusual is living in the waterways of southern Ohio. "The evidence is there," Dr. Walsh explains. "Footprints, photographs, DNA samples, and the testimony of dozens of credible witnesses spanning more than 6 decades. While we don't have a body or completely clear photographs, we have more evidence for the Loveland Frogman than we do for many accepted scientific discoveries." Others remain doubtful. They argue that the lack of clear physical evidence after decades of investigation suggests psychological factors rather than biological reality. Skeptic Dr. Richard Dawson from the University of Cincinnati has studied the case and believes the sightings are based on misidentification of known animals. "The human mind is remarkably good at seeing patterns and filling in gaps," Dr. Dawson explains. "When people expect to see something unusual, they often interpret normal events in extraordinary ways. A beaver swimming in low light can look remarkably humanoid from a distance." Dr. Dawson points to the fact that no bodies have ever been found despite decades of searching. He argues that a population of large, intelligent amphibians would leave more obvious traces of their existence. Food remains, constructed shelters, or other signs of habitation would be visible to trained observers. However, Dr. Dawson acknowledges that some aspects of the case are difficult to explain. The consistency of the witness accounts across multiple decades and the quality of some of the physical evidence suggest that something unusual may indeed be occurring in the Loveland area. The debate continues among researchers and scientists. But for the people of Loveland, the question of the creature's existence has become less important than its impact on their community. The legend of the Loveland Frogman has become an important part of the town's identity. The creature appears on local business signs and tourism brochures. It serves as a symbol of the area's unique character and mysterious history. Annual Frogman festivals draw visitors from across the region. Local artists create sculptures and paintings inspired by the creature. The Loveland Historical Society maintains a collection of frogman-related materials. This includes photographs, plaster casts, and witness statements. The collection is popular with visitors and researchers studying the phenomenon. Elementary schools in the area teach children about the Frogman legend as part of local history classes. The story has become a source of community pride rather than fear. Most residents view the creature as a benevolent guardian of their river rather than a threat. Local environmental groups have even adopted the frogman as a symbol of the need to protect the Little Miami River and its watershed. They argue that whatever the truth behind the sightings, the creature represents the wildness and mystery that still exists in their modern world. Whether the Loveland frogman represents an unknown species, a case of mistaken identity, or something else entirely may never be determined for certain. What remains certain is that for more than 6 decades, the banks of the Little Miami River have been the stage for encounters that challenge our understanding of the natural world. The files in the Loveland Police Department contain testimony from dozens of credible witnesses who insist they saw something that should not exist. The photographs, footprint casts, and DNA samples provide tantalizing hints without offering clear answers. Recent advances in genetic analysis techniques offer hope that future discoveries might finally solve the mystery. If more tissue samples are found, modern DNA sequencing could provide definitive answers about the creature's nature and origins. Environmental DNA sampling is a new technique that can detect genetic material from water samples. This has been proposed as a way to search for evidence of the creatures. This method could potentially identify unknown species living in the river without requiring direct observation or capture. Camera technology has also improved dramatically since the first blurry photographs were taken in the 1970s. Modern trail cameras with infrared capability and motion sensors could potentially capture clear images of the creatures if they are still active in the area. Underwater exploration equipment could also be used to investigate the cave systems that researchers believe might serve as habitat for the creatures. Remotely operated vehicles could explore areas that are too dangerous or difficult for human divers to access. Despite these technological advances, the Loveland frogman remains as elusive as ever. The creature seems to possess an uncanny ability to avoid detection. It appears only long enough to leave witnesses with more questions than answers. Some researchers speculate that the creatures have learned to avoid human technology. The decline in sightings since the 1970s might reflect the being's adaptation to increased human surveillance and investigation. Others suggest that the creatures might be naturally rare. Only a small population might exist in the most remote parts of the river system. Such a population might surface only occasionally. This would make detection extremely difficult. There is also the possibility that the creatures are seasonal visitors to the area. They might migrate from other locations during specific times of the year. This would explain why most sightings occur during spring and fall months. The underground cave systems discovered by researchers in the 1980s remain largely unexplored. These subterranean waterways could provide perfect habitat for an aquatic species that prefers to avoid human contact. Recent geological surveys have revealed that the cave systems are even more extensive than previously thought. They connect the Little Miami River with underground waterways that stretch for hundreds of miles throughout Ohio and neighboring states. If the Loveland frogman is real, it might be part of a much larger population distributed throughout this underground network. Sightings in Loveland might represent only the tip of the iceberg. Similar creatures might be living undetected throughout the region, and somewhere along the quiet waters of the Little Miami River, the truth behind the Loveland frogman continues to wait in the shadows. It remains as elusive as ever. The next time you find yourself driving alone on a dark country road, you might want to remember Officer Shockey's experience. Sometimes the things we encounter in the night are far stranger than anything we've been taught to expect. The boundaries between the known and unknown are thinner than we like to believe. In places like Loveland, those boundaries sometimes disappear entirely. What would you do if something impossible stepped into your headlights? Would you believe your eyes, or convince yourself it was just a trick of light and shadow? The witnesses in Loveland did not have that luxury of doubt. They saw what they saw. They reported what they encountered. And their stories continue to challenge our understanding of what is possible in our world. The mystery endures. It waits for someone brave enough to venture into the darkness along the Little Miami River. Perhaps one day, the truth will finally surface from those dark waters. Until then, the Loveland Frogman remains one of the most compelling mysteries in the annals of the unexplained. If you have enjoyed exploring this mystery with us, like this video and subscribe for more tales from the unexplained corners of our world.